Today is September 1st, 2017, and in tonight's study we are going to continue the investigation of the community rule. Before we begin, though, let us ask our Heavenly Family to bless our meeting. Eloheinu, Heavenly Family, our mighty ones, thank you so much for truth and love. Thank you for correcting us, and thank you for guiding us to actually care about evidence. Please help us to understand the principles, help us to do your will, and to become a people of love and truth and reason. Thank you so much. Help us to change the world. We ask this, B'Shem Tzemach Huahi, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so, as I mentioned, we're going to continue investigating the community rule, and I'll start by explaining briefly what it is, why it's important, why we're studying it, how we're studying it, and our current place in study. So, the community rule is a document that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the years 1946 or 7. It's a little unclear when the first people found them. Up until 1956. That was when the Dead Sea Scrolls were being discovered. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are a rather large library of ancient Jewish texts from about the time of Jesus and even before. Some of the earliest texts date to the 3rd century BCE, and the very latest date to the 1st century of the Common Era, though most are from the first 2 centuries before the Common Era. And the community rule is one of those texts. It comes from the earlier part of the 2nd century BCE, and it represents a group of Jews who were very much so focused on different aspects of principles and teachings which, prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, were only thought to be Christian ideas. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, of course, and you have these ideas expressed in Jewish texts prior to the life of Jesus, it became quite apparent that these ideas are actually Jewish ideas, and that Jesus and his early followers were not really something other than Judaism. They weren't starting a new religion. Their ideas fit quite well within the context of Second Temple Judaism. This is just one of the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls and of the community rule in particular. More specifically, though, the community rule outlines the beliefs and practices, organizational structure, and also the mission of a group of Jews which had their headquarters on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, and their settlement was a place called Qumran, and they are known by most modern historians as Essenes, which is a group of Jews mentioned by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny. Now, this group of Jews was very well respected in their own time. They were a priestly group and also a scribal community, at least those who dwelt at Qumran. Essenes lived all over Judea and perhaps even up into Samaria and Galilee, but they were centered at Qumran. Those there were scribes, and they made it a habit to copy a lot of documents. And they also authored several documents, such as the community rule. So we've been investigating the community rule for over a year and a half now, and the reason why we have devoted so much attention to it is because of its centrality to the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, and also because of its influence on the early Nazarene movement, which is the name of the Jesus movement in first century Palestine, and also even abroad, as Paul brought the Nazarene message to Gentile and Jew alike in the diaspora lands. And the community rule, in telling us about this community, it's quite clear that it contains some of the teachings of the founder of the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, known in the scrolls as the Teacher of Righteousness. As we have discussed in previous meetings, the Teacher of Righteousness was certainly considered to be a true prophet by Jesus and John the Baptist and James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, John, and others. And for that reason, anything which could get us back to the teachings of the Teacher of Righteousness is very, very important. Now, the community rule is also important for other reasons, but we won't go all into that right now. I'll just mention that aside from its importance for the Qumran community and aside from its importance in regard to its impact on the Nazarene movement, it also just has an important message of its own. And in studying the community rule thus far, we have found that the message expressed therein is very much so the same as the message which we have been proclaiming, especially in this phase of the message ever since 2013. So it has definitely caught our eye, and since it has a chance of possibly being written in whole or in part by the Teacher of Righteousness, who we have found to be a true messenger of God, according to his messages delivered in the Thanksgiving hymns. But even if none of the community rule was written by the Teacher of Righteousness, it certainly does contain some of his ideas. So with that said, our methods of examining the community rule start with trying to understand it for what it says. We recognize that it was written over 2,000 years ago, and that the way in which people conceived of the world at that time was very different from how people conceive of the world today. There's not only a temporal difference, however, there's also a geographical difference, and all of those things together also include a cultural difference. So we cannot expect to just read the community rule and interpret it to be conveying ideas which are all precisely the same as the ideas which we modern folk have, and not be misinterpreting it. We should expect there to be ancient ideas contained in this text, but we might not always be familiar with those ancient ideas. And so in reading this, we need to be very careful not to import ideas from our time or from the time of Jesus or from any time after the composition of the community rule back onto the composition of the community rule. So we've been doing this for a while now, and thus far in our studies, the majority of it has been spent on the first 4 columns of the best preserved copy of the community rule, namely 1QS. Upon finishing column 4, however, we have recognized the need to take a look into other aspects of the study of the community rule, especially seeing as column 5 introduces new problems to be dealt with, which require us to get into these other aspects of study. One aspect of study has been textual criticism. Textual criticism is the comparative analysis of all the available manuscripts of a given literary composition in order to determine the history of the wording of the text and hopefully to enable ourselves to discern the earlier or possibly the original reading of a given text. So with the community rule, we have 11 or 12 manuscripts, all from the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of which are fragmentary. And these manuscripts have differing readings from one another. So we want to understand the history of the changes in the wording of the text. We've also talked about paleography, which is the study of the forms of letters as written by ancient scribes and how they changed over time. That is, how the forms of the letters changed over time. In studying those changes, it is possible to get a general idea of how Hebrew writing, in this instance, looked in, say, the first half of the 3rd century BCE, as distinct from how Hebrew characters generally looked in the second half of the 3rd century BCE. And one can then, upon finding a new text, date it according to the forms of the letters. I'll repeat that last bit just because our phone made a little sound there. So by chronicling the development of the forms of the letters across time in a given language, upon finding a new manuscript, you are able to compare it with others and thus determine its date. In other words, if you find a manuscript which you did not know of before, you can look at the forms of the letters and recognize whether it is characteristic of a given period of time which has already been established through paleographical analysis. So paleographers do this. They will study a whole bunch of different manuscripts from different periods of time to get an understanding of the development of scribal practices in regard to the forms of the letters, and not just the forms of the letters, I should say. It is primarily the forms of the letters, but sometimes it's how the forms of the letters are in relationship to each other. And so at one period of time, the letters were kind of a bit more uneven in their sizes. And then as time progressed, they kind of tightened down a bit and became more the same size, all the letters. So even if the shape of an individual letter didn't change a whole lot, its size in relation to others may have. So I just wanted to specify a little bit more. It's not just about the letter Aleph and how it looked at this period of time versus another. No, it's actually looking at how all the letters are written and how they're written together and in combination with other letters, and that gives you a better picture of how things changed over time. So with all that in mind, we were able to get an understanding of how paleographers date texts, and we went through an overview. It's a handy little appendix that is concluded. I'll repeat that again. This overview of paleographical dates for the 11 or 12 manuscripts of the community rule are contained in an appendix that is in the Princeton Dead Sea Scrolls Project Volume 1, the critical edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls edited by James Charlesworth. And in that volume, there is an appendix written by Frank Moore Cross, which gives the paleographical dates for all the manuscripts of the community rule. So, textual criticism, paleography. We've also talked a little bit about textual history versus composition history, and how by comparing the manuscripts, it may be the case that not only are we looking at a transmission of a completed text, but we may be looking at the composition gradually of a text by different authors over a period of time. What that might look like is that the community rule may not have been written by one author. It's a possibility to consider that it may have been written by several independent authors and originally was separate documents that were later compiled. But we do not yet know whether that is the case. The other possibility is that that the community rule is really a single literary work, and then other scribes down the road made excerpts from the community rule with some changes potentially. So that's kind of what we've been looking at. Of course, 1QS is the best preserved copy, so it has a lot of content. But then there are several copies from Cave 4, and they tend to be shorter. The wording is different in some respects, and some of the copies from Cave 4 do not include all of the material that is in 1QS, and some of that is not just as a result of the Cave 4 documents being more fragmentary. It's even content that is actually just not included in a scroll when it was originally written. So, for example, in at least one of the manuscripts from Cave 4, the beginning of the text is the material which parallels 1QS column 5. In other words, that copy of the community rule did not include the material that is found in 1QS columns 1 to 4. Now again, is that because the material in 1QS columns 1 to 4 were originally separate from the material in 1QS column 5, and 1QS represents a combined version of originally independent documents? Or is it that 1QS represents a literary unity, and then this 4QS document that does not contain the material of 1QS columns 1 to 4 is just an excerpt of the community rule, and for whatever reason, columns 1 to 4 were not included? So these are different aspects for us to consider. There are many more aspects as well. But, yes, you have a comment?
Yeah, I don't know if this is the best time for it or not, but it seems like it might be a good time.
Okay, sure.
Just while it's on my mind, the proposition of, I'm not saying that you're suggesting it's this, but one of the options is that 4QS is an excerpt of the complete document represented in 1QS. Well, it wouldn't be unheard of for something like that to be done because they had pocket-size editions, right? And that wasn't the entire thing of 1QS, was it? I'm not sure what's represented in the pocket size, the tiny scrolls, and maybe you know.
Right. What is represented in those tinier scrolls, to my knowledge, none of them that are kind of the really small copies of the community rule contained all the material that's in 1QS. So it could be that it's like, okay, the first 4 columns, a lot of it is theological, and it's not necessarily something that is like basically a copy of conduct among the community, so you wouldn't necessarily need to carry it around with you all the time. But maybe the other stuff, because it's conduct within the community, you might want on hand more easily for quick reference.
Exactly. If you're in a situation and the question arises, how do we handle this, rather than say, well, I seem to recall that it's supposed to be done like this, you can just say, here's how it's done.
Exactly. So it's easy to conceive of that as being an excerpt of 1QS in the smaller edition. However, I'd also say that it's just as easy to conceive of it as originally being separate from what's in 1QS and just being a text that has code of conduct for the community, and it just being done in a small version.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Is it written in the same language as the content of any of the community rule documents, or is it just similar regulations or ways of handling, like you said, ways of conduct? Is it just that it has similarity in language, or is it kind of an excerpt of something?
Some of the copies, the actual copies of what we are calling the community rule, are in that smaller edition.
Okay.
So it is material that is classified as a community rule. However, the scholars are aware of the fact that if it is true that the community rule is a compilation of several independent documents, the phrase the community rule may not be best applied to an earlier document which was later included in the community rule. So let's just say that one of these smaller scrolls just has columns 5 and 6. I don't know if that's the case, but just hypothetically, columns 5 and 6 of 1QS, or the material which parallels columns 5 and 6 of 1QS. Just because it's in a smaller document that's to be carried on the person wouldn't mean that it's an excerpt of the community rule. It could mean that it's just a document in and of its own, and that 1QS represents a later combining, and it included that document, which people happened to already be carrying around in small pocket-sized editions just for convenience. Mm-hmm. But so it could be easily conceived of either way. Mm-hmm. But at some point, yeah, I do want to learn better what material was included in the pocket-size editions. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so 4QS, that is several independent documents. So 4QS just means the community rule documents found in Cave 4. Now, there are 2 manuscripts, 2 community rule copies that were found in Cave 4, which have material that parallels 1QS column 5. So that's what we've been looking at the past couple weeks. We've just been saying, okay, let's just take column 5 of 1QS, which is continuing on our investigation, and we'll look at the other manuscripts which contain the same material. Those 2 manuscripts are known as 4QS manuscript B, as in boy, and 4QS manuscript D, as in David. Now, these two manuscripts are not entirely well preserved or anything like that, but they do contain parallel material. And what we are doing in our comparison, in our study, is to look at all three manuscripts just for the first clause. At least that's how we're starting. And we are carefully comparing them and making observations. And then we are formulating hypotheses in order to explain our observations. And then we test our hypotheses to see whether they stand up to scrutiny. Once we are completed with that for this first clause, we will then move to the second clause and do the same thing. And then we'll move to the next one and the next one until we're done this section, which starts in 1QS column 5, line 1. So in doing this, we really need to have on our experimental thinking caps. And seriously, these studies, guys, have been some of the best studies that we've had in certain respects. Our Heavenly Family really wants to get us all to the point of being able to study and to come to a knowledge of what a text says without speculating, without just reading it and saying, oh, well, this is what it means to me, and this is what it means to me. No, actually conducting an experimental investigation of the text in order to determine what its author or authors actually said. Every one of us needs to be able to do this. So our Heavenly Family is really seeking to teach us the methods which we can employ in order to do this. And when we first got into this careful comparison of this material between these three manuscripts, is really the first time that I've seen amongst us really, like, you know, you guys have been having really, really careful thought, really great hypotheses being put forth, and excellent challenges to each other's hypotheses and to your own hypotheses, and putting them to the test. And I can definitely see that for those of you who were contributing and participating in the discussion, that your way of thinking is far advanced of what it was, let's say, 4 years ago. And that's what it should be, right? We all need to be constantly advancing in our way of thinking. And so it's really awesome. Like the first study that we had on this, I was just so thrilled comparing these texts together. And one of the wonderful things is that this is part of each of us maturing in understanding the principles of how to acquire knowledge. Because these studies have not been you guys sitting here listening to me giving a lecture on textual criticism and the community rule. Yeah, I'll give introductions into our studies, but then we dive in together, and it's awesome. And so I just want to remind you guys again of how when we're going to be putting forth our hypotheses here and then challenging them, we need to be able to separate ourselves from the ideas which we put forth. In other words, if you put forth an idea as a hypothesis, it's okay to be wrong on that. Part of what we're here to do is to challenge hypotheses and to find the truth This is all part of the process of experiment. And so it's okay to put forth a hypothesis and then challenge your own hypothesis. And if someone else challenges your hypothesis, if they say, actually, I do not think that that's true for the following reasons, and then give their reasons, well, that's fine. No one should be offended or hurt because someone disagrees with the idea which they put forth to explain the differences between the manuscripts. It really would be quite fruitless for that to be the case. And if we were to do that, if we were to get upset and hurt because our ideas are being challenged or whatever the case may be, we won't get far at all. If scientists did their work like that, they wouldn't do their work. People get offended and stop working together, and that's no good. So we need to draw together, and the way that we can draw together is to be totally uninterested in the outcome of our investigation. That's the wrong word.
Or unattached.
Unattached is really the word that I should use. But what I mean is we should not care whether the ideas which we put forth end up being the right ones or the wrong ones or whatever. Even, let's just say, hypothetically, that you end up only ever, like throughout all the course of these meetings on the community rule, let's say the whole time, you, whoever you are, apply it to yourself, let's say you always end up saying hypotheses that end up not working, that none of the hypotheses which you put forth actually end up being the right ones. Even if that's the case, don't feel bad about that, because putting forth a hypothesis and then going through the evidence to see whether it stands is part of learning. Even learning what something isn't is helpful. And so, yeah, we need to get into this mindset of experimental investigation, and that's it. So let's get back in now to really studying this. I'll read our two readings again, and yes, we really do for this first clause only have two readings represented in our manuscripts in spite of having three manuscripts. The reason for this is that all of the preserved portions of our K4 manuscripts for this clause agree with each other. For this clause, 4QS manuscript D is entirely preserved. 4QS manuscript B, on the other hand, is fragmentary. But for the preserved portions of it, it agrees with 4QS manuscript D.
I want to ask you a question. You said 4QS D was, for the first clause, completely preserved. In the translation I have here pulled up, it has the words freely volunteer in these interesting-looking symbols, brackets, not brackets, but I don't know what those are called. They look like little arrows. Do you know why it's there? It's not in B. In B, it's supplied along with a bunch of other stuff, but in D, it just has those.
Right. I'm not entirely sure what that is about in this particular translation. Translation of a corrected text. Okay. That's right. There's another note in another edition that I have where basically what happened is that in this manuscript, one scribe made, like, maybe it was a spelling error or something in the main body of the text, and then another scribe came along and wrote the correction.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is the corrected text. So, in any case, we're primarily comparing 4QS manuscript D and 1QS for this first clause because, again, 4QS manuscript B doesn't really add anything to our readings. It's the same as manuscript D for the preserved portions of it. And so, basically we're just looking at these two readings, and since the D manuscript better preserves that reading, then we're going to be just using that as our comparison for this clause. So I will start with reading 4QS manuscript D, fragment 1, column 1, line 1. This is this clause, this little bite of content as preserved in this manuscript. Instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have dedicated themselves to withdraw from all evil and to hold fast to all which he has commanded. Now, this same clause, as it appears in 1QS, column 5, line 1, reads as follows. This is the rule for the men of the community who devote themselves to turn away from all evil and hold fast to all which he has commanded as his will. Now, we have already noted in previous studies several of the differences between these manuscripts, but I will call them to mind again, seeing that it's been almost a week since our last study on this topic. Some of the primary differences between these two readings are, first, the difference in the one addressed in the text. So in the 4QS manuscript B&D, this is instructions for the master, whereas in 1QS, this is rule for the men of the community. So the master is not present in 1QS, at least in this clause. That difference, however, is not so great. I mean, it's there, but it's not like it's just intended for two totally different audiences, because even though the 4QS manuscripts say this is for the master, it says for the master concerning the men of the law. Well, the men of the law is a plural group, and here in 1QS, it's rules for the men of the community, another plural group, or another phrase referring to a plural group. And this group, the men of the community in 1QS and the men of the law in 4QS, seem to be the same basic group in that both of them are further explained as being those who devote themselves to turn away from all evil and hold fast to all which he has commanded. So another element of difference is that the 4QS manuscripts are grammatically sound and they lack redundancy, whereas 1QS is grammatically imperfect and it contains what at least appears to be a redundancy. The redundancy is the phrase, as his will. So, to all which he has commanded as his will. Well, it might seem a little bit redundant to say commanded as his will, because if someone commands something, it could basically be assumed that they're commanding something that is according to their will or as their will. That phrase, as their will, as his will, is not present in the 4QS manuscripts B and D. The grammatical soundness that is in 4QS, which is lacking in 1QS, has to do with the personal pronoun he in 4QS, and in 1QS it is two personal pronouns, he and his. In 1QS, where it says, and hold fast to all which he has commanded as his will, the person identified by the pronouns he and his is not specified. Whereas in 4QS, it says which he has commanded, and the sentence starts with referring to a single individual that could be referred to using the personal pronoun he. So instructions for the master, etc., which he, the master, has commanded. So, with that in mind, we have been putting forth hypotheses to explain these differences. And so, there are a couple of hypotheses which have been put forth representing the text as reflecting different historical circumstances. So, one could say that the reason why a master is present in one reading and not present in the other reading is because there's a historical circumstance wherein there was someone called the master who was present, and then another historical circumstance wherein no master was present. Now, if one views the historical circumstance with the master as coming first and interprets the difference between these manuscripts as representing or reflecting two different historical circumstances, then one could put forth a hypothesis that the 4QS readings come earlier because the master was there in the earlier historical circumstance but absent later. But one could also put forth the historical circumstance as being the reverse, namely that there was first a time without a master, and then later a master arose. And if you take the difference in the manuscripts to reflect different historical circumstances, then you could say, well, 1QS represents the earlier period of time, and it came earlier because there was no master. And then later a master arose, and 4QS represents the time with someone who could be referred to as the master. That's one way of looking at it. And those hypotheses have been put forth, but that is not the only way to view the differences between the manuscripts. They don't necessarily reflect different historical circumstances. Perhaps there was a master all along, and one text did not include it, and then later a text said, well, let's specify this is really for the master anyway, and we all understand that, but let's just specify it further. You know, that's one way that one might view the difference. In any case, one element of study, and this is the one that we've been focusing on for the past couple of weeks, is one aspect of the difference between these two readings, which is the one I mentioned earlier, as being the awkwardness and redundancy element, which is present in 1QS, which is not present in 4QS. In 4QS, it is grammatically sound. In other words, it's not awkward grammatically. It reads very smoothly, and it doesn't have that redundancy. Whereas 1QS has that redundancy and is kind of awkward to read because of the incomplete grammar. Now, we spent a couple weeks looking at whether that indicates 1QS being first or 4QS being first. We talked about the fact that there are examples in the history of textual criticism and in the history of scribal practices wherein there will be a text that is written which is grammatically imperfect and is somewhat redundant. And then later, scribes come along to clean up that text and make it grammatically sound and not redundant. And in those instances, of course, the direction of change is from awkward redundant to smooth and not redundant. In which case, of course, the awkward text would be the earlier one. But there are other instances wherein a text could be originally smooth and lacking redundancy, and then later it could be changed to be more awkward and not redundant. Now, what we discovered as being the way we can tell which it is in a given circumstance is that if the characteristics of the texts show us that the smooth one is not at all different in meaning, but is only changed in terms of its grammar and its lack of redundancy. In other words, if it's only smoothed out grammatically and redundancy is dropped, then it seems to be the case that in those instances, the awkward one was original, because the characteristics of the change are merely grammatical. Then the reason for the change was merely grammatical, and thus it would stand to reason. Yeah, it wouldn't make sense for someone to do it in the reverse order, for someone to keep the meaning all the same and have their only purpose in changing it grammatical, but make the grammar worse intentionally.
And something else comes to my mind to further back that up. You did mention some scribes didn't know how to read and write, but they could copy things. Well, if a scribe knew how to read and write in order to change something to be something else and still make sense, then their ability to read and write is proven. And if they're learned enough to read and write, it stands to reason they would also be educated in the grammar, and there would be absolutely no reason, like it's not an accident, there would be no reason for a learned scribe who could read and write to change the text to be not awkward and redundant.
Yeah.
But if a scribe didn't know how to read and write and they made an error, the chances of them making an error that made sense so much so that it's almost identical in meaning, or basically is identical in meaning in some cases, is next to impossible.
Right, if they didn't know how to read and write.
That's the point.
But if they did, it's actually quite conceivable. So this comes to another type of change that could happen. So basically what we found is that if you can determine that the nature of the change was merely grammatical and to improve its readability by grammatical improvement and taking out redundancy, then the direction of the change goes from awkward and redundant to smooth and not redundant. The other broad category of change, and this one is actually broader, is if you can tell that the scribe had bigger purposes, in a sense, in changing the text. Let's say they had a theological purpose. Let's say they had a harmonizing purpose. In other words, they wanted to harmonize it with another text or their own ideas, or they just disagreed with it factually. In those instances, a scribe might change a text in such a way that serves their purpose, and an unfortunate side effect of that is that it loses some smoothness. It becomes redundant or grammatically awkward. That might happen, and instances of that can be found in the Pentateuch, and this studying the documentary hypothesis shows this quite clearly, how there are instances where scribes combined two originally independent texts and literally wove them together. I guess maybe I shouldn't say literally, depending on how you define that. But, taking like one phrase from one and then putting it with a phrase from another, and then, sometimes it's not like here's a sentence, there's a sentence. It's like here's part of a sentence from one, part of a sentence from another, and that they're all just totally woven together. I mean, there are times where it's like that, and sometimes it ends up being a little bit awkward and a little bit redundant. If you take two stories that are the same story and then put them together, well, you're going to have elements that are repeated if you're keeping the entirety of both stories. So it becomes redundant. But that's happened, and it's there in the flood story in Genesis 6-8. It's in the story of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in Numbers 16. It's in the story of David and Goliath in Samuel. There are a number of instances like that. However, just combining two texts isn't the only time that a text might become more awkward and redundant. Redundancy, that's definitely a good way, in a sense, for that to happen. But scribes might change it for a number of other reasons. Again, theologically, they might add something that is kind of awkward, but they didn't agree with the way the text was in itself. A good example of this is the change in the end of Mark. The Gospel of Mark in the earliest manuscripts ends in Mark 16, verse 8. And the way that it ends is that some women go to the tomb of Jesus, and they are told that Jesus is not there, and they are told to go and tell the disciples that Jesus has risen from the dead, but the women ran away because they were afraid, and they told no one. And that's how Mark ends in the earliest manuscripts. Well, there have been about 3 endings that have been attached to the Gospel of Mark. And some of them, right after saying, and they ran away and did not tell anyone, it says, and then they went and found the disciples and told them. Yeah, okay, well, that's kind of awkward, right? Not necessarily grammatically, it's grammatically sound, but the storyline itself is awkward because you just say they ran away, they were afraid, and they didn't tell anyone. And then you say, and then they told the disciples. That doesn't flow. It doesn't say, and then they changed their minds, they realized that, that they shouldn't be afraid, and whatever. It's just so awkwardly presented. But that makes sense that someone would add that, because if you have a scribe who doesn't like the way Mark ends and says, no, you can't just say that they ran away and didn't tell anyone. No, of course they told people. And so a scribe at some point wrote this ending where they told people. And then another scribe wrote another ending where they told people. And, it's quite apparent in that instance that those 3 other endings are endings that were made by people who didn't like the way Mark actually ended and wanted to make it better. And in doing so, yes, they added material, and yes, it made a little bit of awkwardness, but at least it wasn't as bad as it was before. At least it didn't end with them being afraid of not telling anyone. So the scribes were able to attain what they wanted in terms of changing the ending, where it doesn't end on such a stark note. It ends with something more glorious. And that's just another example of a scribal change which could take place of going from not awkward to awkward. And in this instance, it's not because of combining a text, it's because of adding material. You could also have instances where a scribe might just take out a line, something that they might not like, that might be, they might have a theological purpose of, oh man, I sure don't like that part, I'm just going to remove that. And maybe in removing it, the parts on either end don't entirely match right, and so it's kind of awkward. But, you can tell that if the meaning of the text changes, like if there's a theological change in the meaning of the text, well, it's certainly possible that there's a theological motivation on the part of the scribe. And with that being the case, it can help you determine the direction of change. So those are all instances. There are also other instances where a text can become, let's say it was originally grammatically sound, and it made sense, not redundant, and then it becomes redundant and or awkward without there being a great change in meaning. There are instances like that where a scribe could accidentally add a line or skip a little bit or whatever without changing the theology too much, but it could be that it was originally more smooth. And the way that you would be able to tell in those instances is to see whether there were any of the common scribal blunders that took place. So there are times where a scribe's eye might skip from one line to another as they're copying, and they could just accidentally leave out a bit. Well, that could happen. So those are all, things to consider, accidental mistakes that might add to awkwardness and redundancy. But again, those we should be able to identify by the nature of the mistake, because there are some mistakes which scribes are prone to make, and then there are some which are a lot less likely to be made. Just like if you were to copy something by hand, there are certain mistakes that you might make, and there are certain things that most likely you're not going to make. Like if it's a common word, you're most likely not going to spell it incorrectly. That's not going to be a common mistake. However, if you have a section of content where it repeats a line, like let's say there's a phrase that's repeated and then something else. Like an example of this is da-da-da-da-da-da, for his mercy endures forever. Da-da-da-da-da-da, for his mercy endures forever. Da-da-da-da-da-da, for his mercy endures forever. There are writings like that. There are psalms like that with a phrase that's repeated like every other line. And if you're copying something like that, you might skip from one, his mercy endures forever, to another, his mercy endures forever, and accidentally miss one of the other lines that was supposed to be there. So those are all instances. Another thing that I'll say also for finding out the direction of change in terms of awkwardness is if you have poetic writing that has a particular structure to it, as poetry does, if you have one reading where the poetic structure is retained and another one where it's not retained, the one where it is retained is more likely original. So there's a psalm, I'm forgetting which one it is, whether it's Psalm 112, 127, something like that. There's a psalm contained in the Hebrew Bible that is an acrostic. It has each line starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So the first one is Aleph. The first line starts with the letter Aleph. The second line starts with the letter Bet. And it goes on through the alphabet, each line starting with the next letter. Well, the manuscripts in Hebrew of this psalm that have been preserved through the Masoretic text are missing a letter. So I think it's the Nun. You're going along through the Hebrew alphabet, starting with each letter, and then there's no line starting with the letter Nun. It's just not there. And so for a long time, scholars studying this basically were able to deduce that there's a line missing. And then when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, there it was, the missing line starting with the letter Nun. So, that just showed how, yes, here we have it, here's the original reading, and we know it's the original one because the poetic structure is retained. It was obviously originally written as an acrostic, and so, of course, it had a Nun line. And so, at some point, the amazing thing about that is that at some point, a single scribe copying a single manuscript accidentally left out the line starting with the letter Nun. And it just so happened that all the manuscripts that were preserved until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls were copies tracing back to that particular manuscript where that particular scribe made that mistake. That shows you how it works, When you go back to the early stages of the transmission of a text, you might have one manuscript written by one scribe, and that's kind of the one that wins out. All the other lines of transmission might not be copied. Like, that one might be the one that is copied more and more and more and more to the point where there's no copies that didn't go back to that one copy. So that's what happened here. And that one copy missed a line, and so all the copies in the world were based on that until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So that's just another example of why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important. So anyway, right now, basically we are at the point of comparing our two readings in order to determine which one is more original. And now, in light of the past couple of weeks, we have equipped ourselves with another tool. And that is the principles which we can employ in order to tell in an instance where we have two readings, one of which is awkward and redundant, one of which is not, in which direction the change went. So, let's kind of focus on that aspect still for a bit. Can we tell in this instance, can we apply those principles in this instance to see whether a scribe was just cleaning up the grammar and the 4QS reading came after, or whether there's a change in meaning that we will be able to identify, which could have inadvertently resulted in the reduction of grammatical quality that is present in 1QS column 5, line 1. So what do you guys think? I know Ed mentioned something last week as a possibility of perhaps 1QS representing the later reading, if I'm remembering correctly, due to a change in meaning from between our two manuscripts. So I don't know, Ed, if you want to repeat that idea, and if you want to give support for it or further support or challenge it or whatever it may be. But maybe, Ed, if you're on, maybe we could start with that.
Okay. Yeah, so the proposed hypothesis is that 4QS was first, and that there was a master, and the document was written as instructions for the master concerning the men, just exactly as it's written there. And the he, at the end, all which he has commanded, the he is referring to the master. So then change occurs and there's no longer a master, and they decide that they need to rewrite the document to meet the need of not having a master. And in doing that, they ran into a problem because these are the instructions which he, the master, had commanded. With absence of a master, the rewording becomes awkward, and they're not quite sure how to handle it. So they change the wording from, instructions for the master to this is the rule for the men of the community, and they've got a problem of how to deal with the pronoun he. And it becomes awkward as they're not really quite sure how to do it. It's kind of inferring at this point that it's God's will, in my opinion. So anyway, the awkwardness and the redundancy occurs because of their not really being sure how to handle the situation. It's got to have some kind of authority behind it, and the authority is gone, and so it by necessity requires a change. Okay, so that is certainly in line with the hypothesis that was stated earlier, that basically the change in reading here reflects a change in historical circumstance, but this is actually offering an explanation as to the change in grammar, and basically saying that, the change was not for the purpose of changing grammar. It was for the purpose of reflecting the new historical circumstance. And as a result, the grammar became a little bit awkward. But even the awkwardness in grammar may have served the purpose, because that which he has commanded as his will, the he could be understood as referring to God. So does anyone have any, rather than asking first if anyone has any further support for that, I want to ask if anyone would like to challenge that hypothesis, and particularly challenge the reasons given. So I think that that's important to do, to find out whether those reasons are good reasons for the hypothesis. So does anyone want to explain why those reasons are either good reasons or want to challenge those reasons? Okay. No challenges to that hypothesis. No one agreeing with it. So I guess this is what we're stuck with.
I'm trying to give other people a chance to talk. I'm still wanting to wait and see if someone else has something to offer.
Okay, sure. And since no one said something so far, I'll ask, what ways can you guys think of to test the legitimacy of the proposed evidence for that hypothesis?
One way to test it would be to, if there's another hypothesis, then you can not only test, there's sort of two tests there, because in coming up with another hypothesis, there's a possibility that the two could be melded together. to form an even better hypothesis. But definitely one way to test it is if there's an alternative possibility.
I guess that might end up going either direction, depending on what the alternative possibility is. So one way of testing proposed evidence for a given hypothesis is to say, well, if this hypothesis is true, let's just take an example here. So one of the elements of this proposed change is that it reflects historical circumstances that differ because the master is present in one circumstance and absent in another. In this circumstance, it would be to say, the master was present first and then was no longer present, and 1QS represents the later period in which the master was no longer present. Or at least we should say this reading of this clause in 1QS represents that period. So how might we test that? Well, one way is to say, well, if that is the case, then we should observe the following. So that's making a prediction. Now, it's not a prediction about like what's going to happen in the future in regard to events or whatever, but it's making a prediction as to what we should be able to observe in the present text. So to be more specific, and I'll just offer a way to test this, is to say, well, if it is true that this reflects a historical circumstance where the master is not there, and the purpose of changing the text is to reflect that historical circumstance, then we should not find any other references to the master within this section. Because, of course, if we do find a reference to the master in this section, well, then it's not reflecting a historical circumstance without a master. So that's one way to test this. Now, of course, when we say this section, we have to define what this section is. As we have pointed out in the past, the master is referenced elsewhere in 1QS. But if we are entertaining the possibility that 1QS is a composite document of several originally independent texts, then basically 1QS column 5 could represent a period after the master, and 1QS columns 1 to 4 could represent a period with the master, and someone just combined them without caring that one represents one period and one represents another period. So since that's kind of an option on the table, the way that we would really have to test this is to see whether within this particular section there is reference to the master or not. Because if there's reference to the master within this section in 1QS, well then basically that falsifies the hypothesis. However, if we read this section in 1QS and find no reference to the master anywhere throughout, and we find multiple references to the master in 4QS in the same section, then basically that lends further credibility to the hypothesis and to that proposed evidence for the hypothesis. So what do you guys think of us going through and reading those two sections, keeping our eye out for for that particular difference.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. I just want to find out, though, before we do that, I know, did you have a comment that you wanted to make before we do that?
No. It really wasn't going to add much to anything. This is better time well spent.
Okay. I have a comment.
But I think we should call back in before you start to read that. But we can hear your comment first, Anna.
Yeah, go ahead, Anna.
As we're keeping our eye open, for the wording of the word master, I was also thinking if we can also keep our eye open for these two things are sticking out to me: the men of the community and the men of the law, right? So I'm wondering if there's any historical, in terms of dating, of a time that they referred to the men of the community. Okay, let me reword this. Sorry. Okay, so when the master, during the time when the master was around, was the phrase "men of the law" used commonly, right? And when he's, if it's a time when he was passed away or not existing anymore, then was the men of the community used as a common way of describing, the group of men or the people. So I thought that might be also something to keep an eye out for, those phrases, men of the law and men of the community. If it was a common phrase used during the time the master was around, would be the men of the law, and when he wasn't around would be the men of the community.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so that would be, if such a change in terminology could be discerned, then it, would provide further strengthening to the hypothesis that, one reflects a time in which the master was around, one reflects a time in which the master was not around. So, yes, we can definitely keep that in mind. And, hey, if someone happens to notice anything else that might be indicative of different historical circumstances reflected by these two texts, then, of course, that would be interesting to see as well. So I figure since the hypothesis being put forward is that the reading in 4QS came first, I think it'd be interesting to read 4QS, the 4QS manuscripts, before reading 1QS. But as Teresa mentioned, before reading, we're going to hang up and then call back in, because otherwise our calling card will cut out. However, there is another option, since we're going to be getting into, really, we should read Manuscript D, Manuscript B, and 1QS. We should read all three of these, and it makes sense to do it all in one shot so that it's all fresh in our mind. And the more I think about it, I'm thinking that maybe we should actually do it tomorrow instead of tonight, because if we do it tonight, we're either only going to read one or two of these sections, or two of the manuscripts which represent this section, and not be able to discuss it, or we're going to read all three, discuss it, and we'll be on for another hour, which I think it will be too long. So I'm thinking that it'd be best for us to not do that tonight, and then tomorrow we'll have time to read all three manuscripts, and then we can discuss them and compare them. And maybe then what could happen is that between tonight and tomorrow night, you guys could read it yourselves and take note of differences, And then when we read them tomorrow, you will have already analyzed it to some extent, and then we could have a more fruitful discussion. How does that sound to everyone?
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good.
Okay, excellent. Would someone like to thank our Heavenly Family, and then we'll end the meeting?
I will. Heavenly Family, thank you for the education you're providing for us. Please continue to guide us and help us to really let this sink in and to take advantage of the opportunity to advance in knowledge. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
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 All right. Love you all very much. Shabbat Shalom.